My name is Markian Prokopowicz. I'm an associate professor at the Department of History at Durham University, and we are having a very interesting event here, which we're very happy that it's finally happening. It's a workshop on understanding displacement in Ukraine, and we're trying to see it from interdisciplinary perspectives. And there are two more colleagues from the project who are present here in the room. Katarina Ivashchenko-Stadnik here, a sociologist / historian, an expert on migration, and Tetiana Vodotyka over there, a business historian and an expert in urban studies. One other person who isn't here with us because she's in Ukraine is Natalia Ishchenko, who's been involved for at the earlier stages. She's an expert on education. Now, first of all, I wanted to thank the entire team for bringing this event together, for making it happen. We are really happy that this is actually taking place.
Let me start by saying that Frank is not only a researcher in migration. He is also a traveler, a practitioner, and a policy advisor who have lived through migration, multiple migration experiences, and also experiences of displaced people. Prior to his academic career, Frank was a social worker with migrants and refugees, so he started with this topic. Also, the full-scale Russian invasion in 2022 caught him in Lviv, where he was with his family. So he witnessed himself millions of people fleeing their homes. And finally, today he will be joining us from Turkey, where he is now a lecturer at the Koç University. You probably know Koç University as one of the major migration centers. And there he is a participant of the International Summer School with focus on urban migration governance. Now coming up to his affiliations, let me mention that Frank is a senior researcher and coordinator of the Consortium of Forced Migration and Refugee Research in the Institute of Migration Research and Intercultural Studies in Osnabrück University, Germany. Previously, he was the head of the Migration Department at the German Institute for Integration and Migration Research in Berlin. And also, he spent 12 years in the UK, actually, because he was a senior researcher and also associate professor later on at the Center of Migration Policy and Society, also known as COMPASS, at the University of Oxford. Frank's contributions to the field is extensive, also because he is an advisor to many governments and institutions, including EU Council, European Council, the International Organization for Migration, and also the British Parliament. Please join me in welcoming Frank Durrell.
I query the popular concept of migration systems and suggest that migration order is a concept that depicts better the unequal power relations at play and the imperial and colonial nature of relations in the region. Migration system is often understood in rather technical terms, and as such, the application of the concept migration system is often detached from the broader political and economic processes and certainly neglects the political dimension. And therefore, in my view, migration system appears innocent, almost politicized. Alternatively, the concept migration order, it was introduced by Nick van Heer at Compass, and Frank Pickel's work, he was also at Oxford, is rather related to global economic and political order, notably its changes and transitions. It refers to governance as well as the interplay of structure and agency. It introduces the obvious economic and political disparities and thus depicts much better the political, economic, and political hierarchies which are structuring migration flows. It also reflects better what Tsurapas 2018 identified as migration interdependencies, notably the coercive powers of the destination/host countries. And finally, the concept migration order can be integrated much more easily with the thinking on world political order and world economic order. And notably, in a region dominated by Russia, the concept migration order, in my view, depicts better this often abusive and exploitative relations. And I quote from Diem and the National Kakasi, Kuznetsova, many others. So the exploitative relations Russia has with other countries in the region. And this brings me to my third argument. I reject the popular binary of the global north and the global south because it neglects, yes what, the countries in the east. There is no global east in this binary. It neglects the countries outside of the Western colonial heritage. It spares Russia from the same kind of criticism that the Western powers receive. The binary of the global north and the global south is a kind of intellectual iron curtain that excludes the east from the south and the north. And the global east, and that's a concept suggested by Martin Miller, is a kind of meta category, overarching and merging the concept of Eastern Europe, post-Soviet countries, or Eurasia. It also resonates well, I believe, with Sarakol's notion of the East, stressing its importance for the emergence of the global state order.
Yes, I hinted at that by saying that there were over 2 million Ukrainians in the EU before the war, most of them in Poland, probably 1.5 million. 150,000 registered in Germany, but there are always the not registered, more irregular type of residents. There were such diasporas in Portugal, in Spain, Italy, Greece, dating back to the early 2000s when there was massive Ukrainian labor migration, often irregular to these countries, and there were diaspora organizations of different types. The very, very old diaspora, dating back to the 19th century, diaspora dating back to the post-Second World War, diaspora dating back to the 80s, partly mixing with ethnic German migration from the Soviet Union, including Jews to Germany, and quite some of them also have some Ukrainian background or heritage. The diaspora played an important role during the first couple of weeks of the war and the arrival of displaced persons, to host them, then to accommodate them. And I think that's been very quickly professionalized and covered by the state, so that the diaspora now seems to do more in terms of supporting Ukraine.
So from your perspective, Frank, what should be the questions that we should be asking in this series of events that are of importance right now, so we can kind of open the book in that kind of displacement, migration, mobility, and Ukraine kind of topic?
Of the conventional migration research community, who felt like at various events and conferences, oh, we talk too much about Ukraine, there is this preferential treatment, and what about the Afghans and Nigerians and Eritreans and whatnot. And I felt a very sort of strange tension, competition over attention to the various cases, which I think we need to reflect on.
Thank you very much once again, Frank, for doing this for us. We're very sorry we couldn't meet you in person in Durham, but maybe on some other occasion.
I think everyone here knows exactly what the Homes for Ukraine scheme is, but just to put it in that UK context a bit more, when DLUC launched this in March 2022, it was really significant within the trajectory of UK refugee provision, migration provision. The UK has not had a history of private sponsor refugee hosting, like a lot of other countries like Canada, other places in Europe responding to movement in the 2015 sort of the homestay model. So the research, based on 58 interviews that I did between June and September, finishing last year. So from the point of view of hosts, this is temporary. And that means that hosts want an end point. All the hosts I talk to, even the ones who are really finding it fulfilling, they want an end point. And there's no sort of homogeneity within the host duration. So Lisa, the host in the Northwest, said, "We've not talked greatly about timescales. It's an awkward conversation to have, to be honest. I don't want her to feel unwelcome, that we're kicking her out. For my own sanity, I need an end. I need an end point to know I'm working to." So this huge responsibility on hosts, but this inability to set a deadline and to set a timeline because of those sensitivities, because of those interpersonal dynamics in the house. So this sort of, Catherine Brackel talks about the geopolitics of the home, how the home is not sealed off from everything else. And, so this geopolitics of war, this uncertainty is there in the home, it's keenly felt, that distance that is collapsed. And so these hosting homes are feeling this sort of, this presence.
I'm from Ukraine, and I'm also a participant of the Homes for Ukraine scheme. And also I had an honor to be as a community researcher for the migration Yorkshire in the Yorkshire and Humber region. And I have conducted two research projects on the Homes for Ukraine scheme. Also, we asked them to draw their hospitality experience, and because of the lack of funding, actually the project was supported by the money of the EU, because of the lack of time and funding. So we decided to focus on two main components of successful co-living that can be used by local authorities. And we identified there are communication and space. So some words about participants' characteristics. So 13 interviews, mostly women, 10 out of 13. There were also 3 men. 2 of them were labor migrants who already lived outside Ukraine at the start of the war. 1 man was a minor at the time of leaving Ukraine. But actually it was not my goal to ask how they reached the UK, just their comments. Sometimes British people don't want to tell directly what they think, and at some point there is like a storm and Ukrainian guests don't understand what's going on and why, and then they're asked to leave the house. And from the British perspective, Ukrainians are quite open and sometimes maybe sound rude. And because of that, our participants suggested to discuss cultural differences, to get to know each other better. And advice for guests, need to thank the British who so hospitably opened their doors to strangers from Ukraine, and to be prepared for difficulties, rely on yourself, establish relationships with the owners of the house, and if possible, help them. I also would like to mention something about diaspora that we have already discussed. Of course, I can say in general, but some participants mentioned that they faced not very good attitude from Ukrainian diaspora when they arrived. They were not really welcomed, even coming to our Ukrainian centers with post-Second World War diaspora. And I had very sad and at the same time funny incident. I visited the Ukrainian center in Leeds, and there were a cafe where people from old Ukrainian diaspora worked, and I asked a man, "Are you hosting as well someone?" And he told me, "No, why?" I don't know why you are here, probably because of money. I was so really shocked because like British people, absolutely strangers, decided to help us, but Ukrainian people sometimes. Yeah, and also there is very interesting part about guest comfort zone and the living room phenomenon, as I call this. Like British people prefer to spend time in the living room. That was not very typical for Ukrainians. For several reasons. It can be discussed further, I think. So probably guests didn't want to interfere into the host territory, and they preferred to stay in their rooms, in the kitchen or in the garden, and they depicted these places, for example, like this one. I had personal space here. I always talked on the phone with my loved ones there in the garden of the host.
So the Home for Ukraine scheme, a response by the UK government to the conflict in Ukraine. It gave the opportunity to UK-based individuals to host and sponsor Ukrainians fleeing the conflict. So they were providing accommodation free of rent. In return, they were receiving a thank you payment. At first, it was £350, but then once somebody was hosting for a year, the initial expectation, by the way, was 6 months. That was what was expected of the host, was increased to 500. In exchange, the Ukrainians, which is important to note, they got access to public services, which is not a usual feature of refugees coming in the UK. So they felt very close to Ukraine as compared to other sort of conflicts that, as we know, keep happening. And a very small minority, but it was interesting, had themselves either relatives or personal experience with fleeing conflict. So they were also seeing this as a way to pay back the help that was given to them by other people in their time of need. So special pressure points included helping guests access all these different services that they were entitled to. So their biometric residence card or universal credit, NHS schooling was very difficult to access and there was lack of information around that. And then, of course, how the hosting arrangement would end. So even though the expectation was 6 months, there was no clarity as to who would be responsible for ending the arrangement, how this would be done. The housing market was crazy at the time and still is. So it was very difficult for hosts to navigate that and help their guests on their own. To fill in all of those gaps that was expected the government would act forward to filling, the host instead formed online communities on social media. So lots of them relied on support of other hosts who had started earlier to sort of find out information and navigate all of the challenges. So it's important to help how we design these schemes and how we implement them to if we're looking to have them be viable in other circumstances as well.
I was interested in the kind of demographics of the hosts, in fact, and the socio-economic background. Obviously, a lot of hosts would need to have an extra. Oh, is that still on?
No, sorry.
What was your question?
I was asking in terms of social class and that, the resources it affords to navigate.
Yes. About this qualitative project, also there were mostly elder people, who decided to help.
Just to add, it's pretty, the demographic was pretty similar, and we had lots of doctors and lawyers volunteering, if that's helpful with social class, or professors. So it was pretty much affluent people who had good incomes or savings or a large house or a second property.
Maybe mostly provoked by Eliana's point about the role of the government and what Ukrainians who come over here discover, and generally I think what comes out from all the three presentations is that in some ways the UK government hasn't been involved to the degree that was expected. Now this just lets me think about all the analysis that said how Ukraine managed to survive the war so far because of its civil society, rather than because it was relying on the Ukrainian government. And I think maybe Ukrainians need to also rethink a little bit what they think about the role of their own state now that they have this comparison. So that's just a comment.
Actually, very different. And I mean, when somebody arrives in a location, the expectation requirements are completely different to when they start establishing themselves and start looking for school services, to when they're like 6 months in this process. So the scheme, when we call the role of host, the role of guest, the expectations of guest, and hosting as a service, limits the vision and the kind of potential of the scheme, just because it considers them to be like exactly the same for everyone, regardless if they just arrived or if they're like already for a year in the country, and whether there is a better way of approaching this. And I mean, I've approached it from a conceptual kind of angle, but probably you, with your data, can maybe shed some more light.
It relates to what you've said, and also what you've mentioned earlier. It's about the relationship between government policies and, you know, the expectations of the hosts and the guests. Was there any guidance, any kind of like official guidance for hosts, what to expect, what their responsibilities were, etc., and sort of something similar for guests, what they could expect, how far the support goes, and that kind of thing? So just the relationship between official policies and expectations. Mm-hmm. In terms of like where then, you know, one could potentially predict potential clashes, because if there was nothing, then that's chaos really from the beginning. Yeah.
Another interesting thing is that some hosts, even though they're very eager for the home for Ukraine itself, they don't want it to happen in other circumstances. So because we were asking about like how would you see this, would you do it again for somebody who's not from Ukraine, or like yeah, so that's one thing. About the thing being one process, it's definitely not one process. So you have the matching situation, which was complete. People thought that the government was going to do it, and they didn't. So it was just like going through Facebook mostly, or other charity organizations, and trying to see posts of people like saying, I do this. It was full on like Tinder, but like I don't want to make it sound really bad, but it was sort of like this. That's what they were saying. Like it was like speed dating online, trying to find the right person.
So the hosts who are, as it were, individuals or families who are hosting. There's the host in the sense of a host government, which has all sorts of issues that we've already talked about. We haven't talked quite so much about hosts as kind of local communities, and the sense in which local communities can be a significant resource. They can be a kind of basis for mobilization. I'm thinking of the ways in which, place where I live, you could speak of a kind of supportive network on behalf of Ukraine, which is now extended into, for example, support Gaza, or to lobby on behalf of Gaza. So I'm interested in the kind of dynamics of the host, which is obviously significant for individuals. Let's leave the government to one side. But the idea of a local engagement and mobilization seems to me to be significant as well. Have you found that?
Right.
About local communities, I know there are some groups of hosts, and also in my case, for example, churches can be these places where people exchange ideas about hosting, and they support each other.
And I guess in relation, obviously local authorities had a role as well, and I guess in relation to Anna's point as well, is that devolved government in the UK has control over various aspects of kind of social care, healthcare, so there are differences, there are uneven geographies, and I wondered if any of the speakers wanted to talk about those kind of uneven geographies, because I don't think there's a kind of one experience. And then the other question was more specifically to Tatiana. You talked actually about materials, so things that were non-human in the mattresses, and it's something that I think is interesting in terms of how do we account for the non-human in a kind of hosting arrangement, and this idea of kind of hospitality and welcome as well.
But I don't think we have that much evidence. It was very mixed. So sometimes it was very helpful for them, but it wasn't super practical, as in
having shared responsibility over the guest. It was mostly exchanging information, and maybe sometimes other people who weren't hosting would just drive the guest somewhere if the host couldn't. But on the other hand, we also had lots of hosts who refused to get on social media because they found it very negative. Like, people were complaining a lot about their guests, and they felt like they were being disloyal or disrespectful to their guests by engaging. So that's about the community, about the difference in the locality. Yes, like, it was not just in developed nations, all local councils were completely different in their approach, completely different. So your experience was very much shaped by where you were and how they were approaching it. And going back to social media, because people were so aware of the huge differences, it caused huge problems. So if you know that in Council X they're signing up as guarantors for your guests when they move on, when your council does not even give you the opportunity to apply for social housing, there's a lot of conflict between like the different approaches. So for sure there was a lot to say about the difference in general.